So one of the things I want to share with you today is the power of geography to help in perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, moving towards a more sustainable future. Sustainability is a lexicon of the 21st century. It's a concept that has been introduced and talked about for the last 20 or 30 years, and it's really resonating in the international community, which is why it's so important that we all have a good understanding of what sustainability is and how geographers can contribute to a more sustainable future. So sustainability as a concept has been around for centuries, but in the modern era, really given a kind of a solid, well, not a very solid, a solid definition in 1987 when the United Nations published its report called Our Common Future. And it was really a set of experts that came together from various diverse fields, and they looked at issues around poverty, human health, and environmental degradation. And they concluded two really important things. The first was development as an idea, and as it was being practiced at the time, it wasn't working. It wasn't sustainable in the long term. And the second conclusion they came to was that we really needed a new idea around sustainable development. And so that they introduced this term sustainable development, and they defined it as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It's since become the global standard of sustainability, and it was a good start, but kind of a vague definition. So it might be a little bit more useful to think about and conceptualize sustainability as the intersection of what is called the 3 E's. 1 E is environment, protecting the environment, using resources wisely, and maintaining resource availability for the future generations. The second E is economics, not just eradicating poverty, but allowing people economic opportunities for a fulfilling life. The third E is oftentimes referred to as equity, social equity. That is not just social justice, but good human health and well-being. Where sustainability happens is where these 3 E's overlap. So for example, protecting the rainforest by removing an indigenous community from that area is not sustainability. We took a while to go from the idea of sustainable development as introduced in 1987 to really taking action on sustainability. And perhaps our most first kind of area that we really began to see implementation of sustainability occurred in 2000, when the United Nations launched its Millennium Development Goals. These were a set of 8 goals that were really a challenge to achieve by 2015. And it was an idea, an agenda of 8 pressing issues that the international community agreed on needed to be prioritized. So eradicating hunger and poverty, achieving educational outcomes, promoting gender equality, reducing both child and maternal mortality, combating HIV, AIDS, and other diseases, and working towards environmental responsibility and sustainability. The great news is that we made a tremendous amount of progress by 2015, but most countries did not achieve most of these goals. And there was a sense that we needed to continue to work on this as an international community. And so in 2015, the United Nations launched a new action agenda called the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of them are familiar from the Millennium Development Goals, some of them are much newer and expansive. It's a really big and ambitious agenda that consists of 17 goals, and within each of the goals are a series of targets that countries are challenged to meet. The idea is that these are 17 goals that really embody the 3 E's of sustainability. So for example, SDG number 1, no poverty, SG number 8, good jobs and economic growth. Those really kind of speak to the economic side of the 3 E's. Good health, SDG number 3, SDG number 4, quality education, and SDG number 5, gender equality, resonate with, for example, social equity. And then there's a lot of environmental goals here with number 7, renewable energy, SDG 13, climate change, 14 and 15, life on land and life on water. So the really interesting thing about these goals and why they're so important is because it's the global consensus on how we achieve a more sustainable, just future. It's become the priority area for international investment, both public and private. And it's one of the reasons why I think we have some optimism about the world, because there are all these goals, and 193 countries around the world have pledged to try and achieve these goals by 2030. So as a geographer, I'm excited because I know we have some unique skills and the ability to really help further and advance those sustainable development goals. I'm going to talk to you about the 3 interesting ways that I see geographers as providing really useful information, methods, and analysis for helping with the SDG outcome. The first is we're spatial thinkers. You've heard a lot about spatial thinking today. The second is that we really are one of the few disciplines that really integrates human-environment interactions. And the third is I want to talk a little bit about scale. So I want to start first with spatial thinking. As you've heard today, geographers ask where are things happening a lot. And because we ask where are things happening, it also leads to questions about why things are happening in one place and not other places. We're also very adept at taking a lot of data and beginning to visualize that and beginning to understand and figure out patterns and processes. And oftentimes when we take big sets of data or complex data and we visualize it, one of our products is a map, right? So I couldn't help but make a Game of Thrones reference. Let me give you a historical example. It's 1854 and the city of London is experiencing a massive cholera epidemic, right? At the time, most experts thought that diseases were spread by the foul miasmas in the air. But one man, John Snow, not Jon Snow of Winterfell, that Jon Snow, he thought differently. He thought that there might be a connection between contaminated dirty water and the spread of cholera. So he began to ask his patients, where do you get your water? Where do you live? What were you doing the few days before you got sick? He took that kind of data and he overlaid it on a map of London's streets. And on top of that, he put a layer that showed where the different water wells were, the drinking wells. And he began to see that pattern. He noticed that most of the cholera cases seemed to cluster around one single drinking well, the Broad Street pump. He couldn't convince London's health officials to actually shut down the drinking well, so he had to go out himself and break the arm of the pump off. And within a couple of days, the cholera epidemic had begun to subside. So that's spatial thinking that not only transformed our world and our understanding of disease, it was also a great first example of using GIS. So what does spatial thinking look like when we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, let's take the example of SDG number 1, trying to eradicate poverty. There are about 760 million people that, according to the World Bank, are poor. They are making less than $2 a day. So we have a lot of people that we have to bring up from poverty if we're going to achieve SDG number 1. One of the things we need to know is where are those 760 million people, right? One way we can do that is to measure poverty, is to also look at a proxy for poverty, which is looking at income. So this is a table that is showing you GDP per capita, or generally average income. And the table on the left is showing you the 10 richest countries in the world, with Qatar with about $146,000 per person. And on the right, you're looking at the 10 poorest countries, with the Central African Republic making about $640 per person. That's a big wealth gap still, right? And of course, you want to remember that in the Central African Republic, there are probably a lot of people making less than $640 a year. Now imagine if we're going to take all 193 countries and create a big spreadsheet or a table, we would have a really hard time seeing patterns and trends. Things wouldn't be in alphabetical order, they wouldn't be in geographical order. Except for geographers can take that kind of data and they can create spatial outcomes by looking at something like this map of income. So this map of an income is kind of the story of uneven development, of uneven outcomes in wealth, right? Dark green countries are among the wealthiest, light yellow and orange countries are among the poorest. So being able to think spatially about poverty helps us to know where should we intervene the most? Where should our resources, our limited resources, be put to best use if we're really serious about eradicating poverty? Let's take SDG number 2, ending hunger, zero hunger. Once again, there's about 800 million people, almost 1 billion people hungry on this planet. But we can't end hunger if we don't know where they are, right? So this is a global map of hunger. Countries listed in blue are countries that are pretty food secure. But countries that are in red and maroon are some of the most food insecure countries on the planet. In some cases, those maroon countries, like Chad, 1 out of every 3 people is hungry. Right? So being able to map this outcome, to map the data that we have, helps us, again, to know where our intervention should take priority. Toggle back to the map on poverty, and many of the countries that are on our poorest, that come out with poorest levels of income, are also some of our hungriest, right? So now we see a correlation between hunger and poverty. And the interaction between hunger and poverty is a really big challenge. To solve both SDGs means that we have to integrate our efforts and our responses. Our second skill as geographers is the human-environmental connections. We've got a long, rich history of looking at and understanding how human activities have changed the landscape. Whether we're altering the natural flow of rivers, chopping down trees, terracing the hills for agriculture, or having the audacity to build islands out of nothing in the middle of the Persian Gulf, human activities are changing the physical environment of this planet. Perhaps you've heard that term Anthropocene. It's kind of a recent term that's had a lot of currency lately. It really refers to this notion that humans are impacting the Earth's physical systems, atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, and because of our human activities, in particular the burning of fossil fuels, that this has had a huge impact and is changing the planet dramatically in many places around the world. Which makes us, particularly as geographers, a good discipline to look at climate change, right? SDG 13, trying to take action on climate, is probably one of our most pressing issues. And yet, as geographers, we approach understanding climate change not only as human-environmental interactions, but also as the uneven impacts that climate change may have. Change is not going to be the same everywhere, right? We're probably going to see more fierce winds, winters in Minnesota, and more hurricanes in Florida, more wildfires out west in California. And these are going to be costly. It's estimated that last year alone, the US lost $90 billion in disasters. So understanding kind of where some of these climate impacts, what types of climate impacts, whether we're talking about where will we see hotter summers, where will we see more rain, or where will we see drought, these are important geographic results and consequences of climate change. And some geographers who are particularly skilled in the techniques have been doing some great climate modeling. And here, for example, showing you a very compelling and perhaps scary image of what might happen to lower Manhattan should there be an 8-foot level in sea rise. So being able to visualize change, being able to kind of understand where change is going to happen is a really big part of how geographers can contribute to a lot of the work that's going to go on with climate change. And the last thing that geographers have a skill at is looking at scale. And we've heard a little bit of that today. But I want you to think of scale as the Russian nesting dolls. The big doll is the global picture, right? The next doll down in size are regions like North America, Sub-Saharan Africa. The next doll down in size from that is a country, Brazil, the United States, and so on until we get to the tiniest doll, which might be your neighborhood. Geographers are really good at taking one process or one trend and being able to look at it in the context of scale. So let's think about climate change. Many of you probably remember this last winter when we had a wobbling polar vortex that dumped very cold temperatures on the Midwest. Minneapolis was minus 27. And we had some conversation about where was climate change, where was global warming when we have such cold temperatures. Well, if you don't know how to look and appreciate scale, you might be tempted to think that this refutes the notion of climate change. But actually, if we scale out to the rest of the United States, LA was a balmy 62 that day. And if we look at scale and go all the way out to the global picture, the entire southern hemisphere was experiencing record heat. It's 105 degrees in Sydney, Australia, on the same day it was minus 27 in Minneapolis. So understanding scale and having the ability to go from the local to the national to the regional to the global and back again is a really important part of understanding really complex global change and dynamics. Let me revisit scale in hunger. Because this map that I put up before, I hinted that the United States comes across as a blue country, a fairly food-secure country. But if we think about scale, it's really an important part of the hunger picture, because in fact there are 30 million Americans who are hungry, right? We have some work to do in this country on almost all the SDGs. One of the things that we've discovered is that geographers have thought outside of the box very creatively. They've taken information about where people live in relationships to their access to grocery stores. And they've come up with a concept called a food desert, which is defined as an area that has a lack of access to healthy and affordable food. This is a map of the city of Chicago, and all those green areas are places where people don't have access to healthy and nutritious foods. Those green areas are food deserts. And I bet a lot of people who are living in those green areas are some of our hungry. So by doing this, we've given the city of Chicago some incredibly important tools. They now know where they can put some of their resources to fight hunger. They now know where they might want to try and incentivize grocery store chains to open up in some of these neighborhoods. So being able to kind of see scale allows us to dig a little deeper than that bigger picture of the United States being a fairly wealthy and food-secure country. All of that is to say that this is not your parents' geography. This is not even your grandparents' geography. This is geography in the 21st century. It's exciting, it's cool. We have the ability to help solve some of the most critical problems on this planet, right? We think spatially. We understand and want to understand the relationship between human activity and the environment. We think of scale. And these three skills are in huge demand right now. There are many jobs out there for young people that can think spatially, that can do some of our mapping, that can appreciate scale and analyze scale and connect it back to human-environment interactions. So when we're thinking about some of the ways in which we can make a better community, we can make a better world, getting to sustainability and reaching and achieving those sustainable development goals is so critical, and I know that geographers are going to be right front and center helping us advance sustainability. Thank you.